Our two stories today are both about people who believed in something so strongly that it informed every single choice they made. And unfortunately for them, those choices led them down very dangerous paths. But before we get into today's two stories, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you have come to the right place because that is all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So, if that is of interest to you, the next time the like button sneezes in public, instead of politely saying bless you, just scream shut up. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you do not miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let us get into today's stories. One afternoon in November of 1980, 28-year-old John Reed sat at a table on a hotel veranda in the tiny village of Barcelos, Brazil, which was a 2-day boat ride up a river from the Amazon jungle's largest city of Manaus. And sitting across from John was the legendary chief of the Uga Mongola tribe, Tatunka Nara. Now, John had been in Barcelos for about 10 days now, and in that time he had already spoken to Tatunka many times. But still, it was like every conversation they had gave John this incredible sense of awe. He really felt like his whole life had been leading up to this exact moment of being here in Barcelos, about to go on this grand adventure. This was a place where the jungle seemed to crowd in from all sides, and the humid air was so thick you could almost taste it. The sounds of insects and birds created a constant background drone that never seemed to stop. So Barcelos and Tatunka were very far away from where John had grown up. John grew up in San Francisco, California. But even growing up in those suburbs as a kid, he had always dreamed of coming here and literally meeting Tatunka. So, it was like surreal he had really done this. And if things from here on out went the way John hoped they would, he might never have to even go back to America. Because John was on a bona fide quest. John was in Barcelos to be the person who finally found the long-lost city of Achor. Now, there was almost no record of the city ever actually existing, except for in one book called The Chronicle of Achor, which was by a German author and journalist named Karl Brugger. Karl wrote that Achor was the capital city of a 12,000-year-old civilization, similar to the Incas or ancient Egyptians in that they had lived thousands of years ago and had a big empire and an extremely advanced civilization for their time. But according to Karl, Achor and its people were way better because they were descendants from actual gods. When the Europeans eventually came to the Amazonian jungle, the people of Achor did not get wiped out because they went underground. And it was there underground that they rebuilt their capital and literally hid their civilization from the modern world. And in fact, the legend said that they actually still live there now, guarding a treasure that had been given to them by the gods. Most people called Karl's book complete fiction and said that its author just sort of made it up to make money. But John had not paid any attention to the naysayers, and any possible doubts that he had completely disappeared the moment he had finally met Tatunka. Tatunka was not only a famous chief who knew the Amazon like the back of his hand, but more importantly, he had actually been interviewed in Karl's book, and he was said to be the one known person who had actually been to Achor who was still alive. And here Tatunka was in the flesh, sitting across the table from John in all his Amazonian glory. He wore just a loincloth, and he had that same turtle tattoo that the book described. So John knew he was the guy. He was the chief he had been looking for. Right now, though, neither John nor Tatunka were saying anything, which was unusual because normally their meetings were very animated as Tatunka regaled John with all these amazing stories about Achor and what it was like there in his very heavily accented English. But hearing these stories had not been enough for John, who really wanted to know where Achor actually was so that he could actually see it with his own eyes. So far, Tatunka had not told John where it was. He had said that the people of Achor wanted to stay hidden. You know, their survival depended on it, and so he was not going to give up their location. But today, John could feel that something was different because just a few minutes ago, John had asked Tatunka again about literally going to Achor. And now Tatunka had been very quiet for a very long time, like he was thinking about whether or not to finally reveal its location. And so John patiently waited. Almost 9 years later, on an evening in the spring of 1989, John's sister, 35-year-old Sandy Reed, pulled into the driveway of her San Francisco area home and got out of her car to check the mailbox. Sandy had just gotten back from her sales job, and she was tired and blurry-eyed as she reached into the box and mindlessly pulled out a stack of mail. But as she began sorting through the mail, the return address on one of the envelopes made her stop. It was a letter that was postmarked from Germany, and Sandy didn't know anybody who lived in Germany, and so she really wasn't sure what to expect as she quickly ripped it open. But as her eyes scanned the lines on the page, her hands began to shake uncontrollably. The letter was from a German detective who said that he was writing about her brother, John, and that they were sure something bad had happened to him. So John, Sandy's brother, had gone to Brazil almost a decade earlier to find the lost civilization of Achor, and Sandy and her parents had not heard from him since he left. Now, during the first few weeks of John's trip, he had written letters fairly regularly, but then his last message had come in late 1980, and after that, nothing. Now, of course, Sandy had been worried about her brother, but she also had not been that surprised. He had gone radio silent because Sandy and her parents were well aware that John was obsessed with Acor. And not just that, he wanted to go on this adventure, find this lost city in the jungle, and then never come home. He wanted to stay in the jungle. And so they kind of figured that maybe he found Acor, or maybe he just found another village somewhere. But either way, the way they looked at it, John likely wanted to start a new life somewhere else, somewhere in the jungle, and that is probably what he had done. They remembered how he had always been a wanderer, someone who was never quite satisfied with the boundaries of their quiet neighborhood. But now, as Sandy is reading this letter, it was like suddenly her understanding of what was going on with her brother was totally and instantly fractured. Now she was both panicked and also totally confused about the idea that John was in trouble, and she could not understand why the German police were looking for her brother. Why wasn't the American police looking for him? But as her eyes frantically scanned the page, she learned why. The detectives said they were investigating the death or disappearance of John and at least 3 other people, including a German citizen, who apparently had been lured into the Amazon by a particular book about a place called Acor. This book, according to the detective, was complete junk. It was a fabrication, and Acor was not a real place. But the detective believed that someone was killing the people who came looking for it. The detective said they had tried to investigate, but the Brazilian officials were being very uncooperative, and he wasn't actually allowed to go to Brazil to collect evidence to try to figure out what happened here. And so, basically, he was stuck, but he wanted her to know they were looking into her brother. And so by the time Sandy finished reading this letter, she felt like she had to do something. If the German police could not go to Brazil, maybe she could. Sure enough, later that same year in June, Sandy arrived in the city of Manaus in the Amazon and checked into her hotel. She knew from John's letters from 10 years ago, before he disappeared, that this was the general area he had been. And so her plan was sort of roughly speaking to search the city, turn it upside down, and see what she could learn. Now obviously this was a big undertaking. Manaus is a big place. But Sandy at this point was all in on this mission. Sandy didn't really know why, but for 10 years basically she had no idea what happened to John. But it was like now she felt like she was being called to do whatever she had to do to go find her brother. So she had quit her sales job, emptied her savings account, bought a flight here, and brought along an audio tape recorder so that she would basically not miss anything, talk to everybody and learn whatever she could and track it. And her plan basically was to just spend all her time interviewing locals, recording what they say to try to figure out if anybody knew about John or Acor. But almost as soon as she actually began doing this on the ground in Manaus, she realized how hard it was going to be. It had been almost a decade since her brother had gone missing. So when she met with the Brazilian law enforcement, they had virtually no details about his disappearance and really couldn't tell her anything useful. And when Sandy spoke to local residents, all she heard were endless rumors with no actual evidence. And on top of that, all the rumors she heard sort of contradicted each other. Some said a white man matching John's description had just recently been seen on the outskirts of Manaus. But then another person claimed John had been shot years ago and his bones had been found deep in the jungle. And then yet another person said none of that was true, and what really happened was John found a tribe in the Amazon, not the people of Acor, but another tribe, and he had decided to just live with them. Now, even though all this information she was getting was sort of all over the place, there still was one common reaction that almost everybody Sandy spoke to had, and that was fear. Each time Sandy asked about Acor, people would sort of clam up like they were scared of it. They all clearly knew about it, and most of the time when she brought it up, she was warned to sort of leave it alone. Like, do not talk about that, and that in some ways looking for Acor could get her in trouble or even killed. So, as the days wore on, Sandy just felt herself feeling more and more confused and anxious, and each night as she laid in her hotel bed, she wondered if she should just give up, that this was impossible. But then, it was like every night after she would drift off to sleep, she would have a dream about John. It was like he was haunting her, and he would say to her in these dreams that Acor was not what he thought it would be. So just about every morning when she woke up, she would have this sort of refound sense of purpose, and she would continue to look for her brother, but it just kept going nowhere. However, during her last few days in Manaus, basically based on finances, she was running out of money and would have to go home soon. During that time period, she heard another rumor, and that was that John had gone into the jungle to find Acor, but he hadn't gone in there blind. A local chief named Tatanka had told John how to get there. Now, by this point, Sandy had spent 3 weeks in Manaus and its surrounding areas and really felt completely overwhelmed. She really hadn't made much progress anywhere. There was definitely a sense of fear around Acor, and she was even starting to feel that looking into this could potentially get her into trouble. And in many ways, hearing about this new person, Tatanka, whether they were real or not, actually made her scared. She would love to learn what he knew, to go find Tatanka and see if he knew where her brother was, but there was also a part of her that just feared even pursuing this lead. It was like all of a sudden Brazil just felt too overwhelming for her. And so after learning about Tatanka, Sandy's reaction was actually to pack up and leave. But after leaving Brazil, Sandy did not just fly to California and give up on the search for her brother. She just decided to look for her brother sort of in a roundabout way. She had heard from a local in Brazil that there was a Swiss tourist who might have seen John in the jungle. And so after Sandy left Brazil, she went to Switzerland and spoke to this tourist. And then after speaking with that tourist, she flew to Germany and she met with that detective who had sent her the initial letter she got. But neither the tourist nor the German detective had any new information. So by the end of all that, Sandy still had no answers. And by this point, she also had no money. She had completely drained her savings account trying to find her brother, and it had not worked. Sandy considered just going home. She was broke, she was scared, and really, she hadn't actually gotten anywhere in her search for her brother. But there was still one lead that she had not investigated, and that was Tatunka. Because basically, it just felt too scary, she had abandoned it and left for Switzerland and Germany. But Sandy felt like now, if she never went back to Brazil to speak with him, she would never get any real answers. It felt like Tatunka was the key, and she had been cowardly. She needed to go back there. She needed closure. So she went back to America, but she only stayed long enough to earn some quick cash cleaning houses so that she could finance another trip to Brazil on June 21st, 1990. So about a year after she had made her first trip, Sandy did return to Brazil. She took a small plane to the village of Barcelos, which she had learned was where Tatunka lived. This time, though, she brought some backup with her, a documentary producer, and also a reporter. She felt a lot safer coming here with a group, but also she did want to draw attention and resources to eventually help her with her brother's case. When they landed at the rundown airport, Sandy and her small team deboarded and walked straight into the tiny village. In the time that she had been back in America earning cash, Sandy had done some research on Barcelos. So, she knew by now that Karl Brugger's book, The Chronicle of Achor, the book that John had been so interested in that led him on this quest, had really spawned an entire economy in Barcelos since tourists came to talk to Tatunka and to try to find it. But as far as Sandy could tell, the tourist boom had not done much for the village of Barcelos. It was dirty and the houses were all very rundown shacks. She had read that only about 3,000 people lived there, and between all of them, they only had one phone. And so, as the group wandered around looking for a friendly face to give them directions, Sandy spotted a woman who was hanging her laundry up on a line outside her home. So Sandy approached her and asked if she knew where Tatunka lived. And the woman immediately nodded, which Sandy expected because Sandy had not just read up on Barcelos, she now knew a lot about Tatunka as well. And she knew that basically everybody in this area knew his name. He was a renowned chief who had once led an expedition for the famous explorer Jacques Cousteau. And he was a hero too. One time he had saved the lives of a dozen Brazilian soldiers after their plane had crashed in the Amazon. So the country's secret service was actually in Tatunka's debt. And also, of course, Tatunka was interviewed extensively in the Chronicle of Achor, that book, and was the only known